The notice was nailed to the post outside the general store, its sharp corners already curling in the biting wind of late October. It was written in Mayor Thompson's officious, looping script, a stark black declaration against the cheap white paper. It announced, with a regret that was purely for show, that due to the unforeseen loss of the winter logging shipment and an early, unyielding frost, the town of Prosperity's firewood reserves would be subject to strict rationing. Each household was allotted 1/4 cord per month, effective immediately. For Elara Vance, reading the notice with eyes that had seen too much for her 18 years, the words were not an inconvenience. They were a death sentence. She was a widow, a title that sat upon her shoulders with the weight of a burial shroud, ill-fitting and premature. Her husband, Thomas, a good man with strong hands and a quiet smile, had been taken by the fever 6 months prior. The same fever had claimed her mother and father within the same terrible week, leaving her utterly alone on a small, mortgaged plot of land at the edge of town. The house was a simple wood-frame structure, built with haste and optimism, but it was drafty and poorly insulated, a sieve for warmth. A 1/4 cord of wood would not last a week in such a place, once the true, deep cold of the plains winter arrived. It was an impossible arithmetic, a calculation that always ended in zero. Her savings amounted to $47 in silver coins, kept in a small tin box beneath a loose floorboard. It was the sum of her entire worldly wealth, a pittance against the coming frost. She had no family to appeal to, no powerful friends to bend the new rules. She was an island, and the tide was rising. As she stood there, the wind whipping a loose strand of her dark hair across her face, she felt not panic, but a cold, hard clarity. The town's solution would kill her. Therefore, she would have to find her own. The memory came to her then, unbidden but welcome, a ghost of a voice from a warmer time. It was her grandfather, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles from a life lived outdoors. A trapper who had learned his ways not from books, but from the land and the Pawnee who had inhabited it for centuries. He had spoken of the earth itself as a blanket, of the deep, abiding warmth that slept just beneath the frozen crust of the world. He had called it a winter house, a lodge of sod and earth, a shelter that did not fight the winter, but yielded to it, borrowing its strength. At the time, she had listened with the detached interest of a child. Now, she listened as if her life depended on it. Because it did. On October 29th, 1887, Elara Vance walked into the town hall. It was a spare, imposing room, smelling of stale cigar smoke and old paper. The Prosperity Town Council was in session, which consisted of 3 men who believed the world turned upon their pronouncements. Mayor Thompson, a portly man whose waistcoat was a constant strain against his ambition, Reverend Miller, whose piety was as thin as his lips, and Jedediah Croft, the most successful farmer in the county, a man who equated his wealth with unimpeachable wisdom. They sat at a heavy oak table, a triumvirate of settled opinion. She stood before them, a small, solitary figure in a patched but clean dress. She did not plead or weep. Her voice was steady, devoid of emotion, as she made her request for an exemption to the wood rationing. She explained the state of her house, the impossibility of the allotment, the simple fact that she would not survive. She asked not for charity, but for a chance. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat, a sound of practiced dismissal.
"My dear Mrs. Vance,"
he began, the title a casual cruelty, a reminder of her loss.
"We are all making sacrifices. The entire town. To make an exception for one would be to open the floodgates. It is a matter of public order."
Reverend Miller leaned forward, steepling his fingers.
"The Lord provides, my child. but he expects us to be prudent. Perhaps you are not as provident with your late husband's resources as you might have been. Faith and fortitude are what is required in these trying times, not special dispensations. The insinuation hung in the air, a foul vapor of blame. It was then that Alara laid her plan before them. She explained that she would not require a larger allotment of wood. In fact, she would require almost none at all. She would relinquish her entire share back to the town reserve. In exchange, she asked only that they not interfere with her work. She described in clear and simple terms the structure she intended to build. A semi-subterranean dwelling dug into the earth with a frame of logs and a roof of sod. A thick silence descended upon the room, followed by a soft, incredulous chuckle from Jedediah Croft. He looked at the other two men, a shared glance of patronizing amusement. "A hole," Croft said, shaking his head. "The girl wants to live in a hole in the ground, like a prairie dog." "It is an earth lodge," Alara corrected, her voice still level. "It uses the geothermal heat of the ground and the insulating properties of the soil. It will be warmer than any frame house in this town, and it will require a fraction of the fuel." She spoke of thermal mass, of windbreaks, of principles her grandfather had taught her, words that were foreign and nonsensical to the men at the table. "Savage nonsense," Reverend Miller declared, his face hardening. "That is the talk of heathens, not of good Christian folk. Our Lord built with wood and stone, not by burrowing in the dirt. A house should reach for the heavens, not hide within the earth. It is an affront to decency. A home is a testament to man's dominion, Mrs. Vance, not a surrender to the wilderness." "And it is a grave you're proposing to dig, young lady," Mayor Thompson added, his tone shifting from dismissive to stern. "An unsanitary, damp pit that will surely give you consumption before the first snows settle. We cannot, as the governing body of this community, condone such a reckless, self-destructive act. Permission is denied." Alara met their gazes, one by one. She saw in their eyes the unyielding certainty of men who had never been wrong because they had never been truly tested. They were men of rigid lines and right angles, and she was proposing a circle, a burrow, a way of living that was ancient and alive. "I did not come here to ask for your permission," she said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "I came to inform you of my intentions. The land is mine, the labor will be mine, and the survival will be mine." She turned and walked out, leaving the three most powerful men in prosperity speechless in her wake. Her first stop was the mercantile. The proprietor, a man named Henderson, watched her with pity as she counted out her money. She spent $27 on the essentials: a small, efficient cast-iron stove no bigger than a milk crate, 20 feet of stovepipe, a new spade with a sharpened edge, a sturdy pickaxe, and a heavy wool blanket. She bought a large roll of oilcloth and a box of nails. The purchases drained her savings, leaving her with a scant $20. To that, she added the proceeds from selling her late husband's silver pocket watch, a transaction that felt like a betrayal but was a necessity. It brought her another $10. $30 and a will of iron were all she had left to face the winter. She began the work on November 1st, 1887. The site she chose was on a gentle, south-facing slope at the northern edge of her property. It was a location her grandfather would have approved of, sheltered from the prevailing northwesterly winds and positioned to catch the low arc of the winter sun. The first task was to mark the perimeter, a perfect circle 20 feet in diameter. She did this with a stake, a string, and a piece of charcoal tied to the end. Then came the excavation. The ground was hard, the topsoil already stiff with frost. The work was brutal,
a relentless cycle of swinging the pickaxe to break the earth and shoveling the loosened dirt into a wheelbarrow. Each swing jarred her shoulders, each shovelful strained her back. Her hands, unaccustomed to such labor, were raw by the end of the first day. By the end of the first week, they were a mass of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. She worked from the first light of dawn until the purple dusk made it impossible to see, fueled by stale bread, dried apples, and a grim determination. The town watched. At first, it was a curiosity. Children would wander to the edge of her property to stare at the lone woman digging a massive hole in the ground. Then came the whispers, the head shaking, the pronouncements of her insanity. Jedediah Croft rode by on his horse one afternoon, pausing to look down at her in the deepening pit. "You are digging your own grave, girl," he called down, his voice thick with certainty. "There is still time to admit your folly. The church can find you a place to stay.
A cot in the poorhouse is better than a frozen tomb of your own making."
Ilara simply looked up at him, wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty glove, and went back to digging. She did not grant him the dignity of a response. After 2 weeks of relentless effort, the pit was complete. It was an impressive sight, a precise circular depression 20 feet across and 6 feet deep. The earth she had removed was piled neatly nearby, ready to be used for the roof. The next phase was the framework. This required lumber, which she could not afford to buy new. So she became a scavenger, walking the creek beds and wooded patches for miles, collecting fallen cottonwood and poplar saplings. She dragged them back to her site one by one, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it settled in her bones. She needed 4 main support posts, thick and strong, to hold the central weight of the roof. She found them in a stand of deadwood half a mile away, and it took her an entire day to chop them down with a small axe and haul them back. Following the remembered instructions of her grandfather, she set these 4 posts in a square at the center of the pit, burying their bases deep into the floor for stability. At the top of each post, she painstakingly carved a notch. Then came the 2 massive horizontal beams that rested in those notches, forming the central support for the roof. Hoisting them into place by herself was a monumental task of leverage and brute force, a puzzle of physics that left her bruised and exhausted, but ultimately successful. From this central square, the roof rafters radiated outwards like the spokes of a wheel, their inner ends resting on the main beams and their outer ends resting on the earth at the edge of the pit. She laid dozens of them, smaller saplings spaced about a foot apart, creating a conical framework that rose gently to a flattened peak in the center. She left a square opening in the middle, directly above the planned location of her stove, for the chimney. This part of the construction took another week, a slow, methodical process of measuring, cutting, and fitting. The town's disapproval grew more vocal. Reverend Miller delivered a sermon on the sin of pride, his gaze sweeping over the congregation and lingering on the empty space in the Vance family pew. He spoke of those who, in their arrogance, reject the wisdom of the community and embrace strange, ungodly ways. He did not say her name, but everyone knew who he meant. The women of the town, who had once offered her condolences, now crossed the street to avoid her, their faces masks of pity and censure. She was no longer just a widow. She was the town lunatic. Ilara was oblivious to their scorn, or perhaps she simply chose to ignore it. Her world had shrunk to the circle of earth, the scent of fresh-cut wood, and the satisfying logic of the work. She found a strange peace in the physical toll, a clarity in the exhaustion. Each completed step was a small victory, a tangible piece of her survival. She was not just building a shelter, She was building a fortress against the judgment of the world. With the wooden skeleton of the roof in place, she began the most critical phase, the insulation. She started by weaving a dense lattice of willow branches across the rafters, creating a tight mesh. Over this, she laid a thick layer of prairie sod she had carefully cut and saved during the excavation. She placed the sod squares grass side down so the root systems would interlock and form a solid, living membrane. This layer was nearly a foot thick, a dense blanket of earth and grass that would both insulate and breathe. On top of the sod, she packed a 6-inch layer of the clay-heavy soil from the deeper parts of her excavation. She mixed it with water to the consistency of thick mortar and applied it meticulously, sealing every gap, creating an impermeable barrier against moisture. Finally, she covered the entire structure with the remaining topsoil, raking it smooth and seeding it with the same tough prairie grasses that grew nearby. When she was finished, the structure had all but vanished. It was little more than a gentle, grass-covered mound rising a few feet from the landscape, a natural feature, almost invisible. The entrance was a work of specific genius, a design element crucial to the lodge's function. She did not simply cut a door in the side. Instead, she dug a trench, about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, leading down into the dwelling. This entrance tunnel sloped downwards before rising back up to the interior floor level. It acted as a cold sink, a trap where the heavier, cold air would pool and settle, prevented from entering the warmer living space. She framed the trench with wood and covered it with the same layers of sod and earth, creating a tunnel. The outer door was a simple, heavy plank construction. The inner door was a thick wool blanket, which would allow for air exchange without creating a draft. Her final task was installing the stove. She placed it in the center of the lodge, directly beneath the opening in the roof. The cast iron stove was small, but in the enclosed, well-insulated space, it would be more than sufficient. She carefully fed the stovepipe up through the opening, packing the gap with a thick collar of fire-resistant clay to create a perfect seal against both weather and fire hazard. The pipe rose only a few feet above the sod roof, a thin metal flag marking her hidden home. By the 3rd week of November, it was done. She moved her few belongings from the cold, empty frame house into the earth lodge. A simple mattress, her tin box of coins, a few cooking pots, and a small stack of books. The frame house she left to the wind and the cold, a monument to a conventional way of life she had now abandoned. The first night she spent inside was a revelation. Outside, a bitter wind scoured the prairie, rattling the windows of the frame house and finding every crack in its walls. But inside the earth lodge, there was only a profound and absolute stillness. The silence was the first thing she noticed, a deep, earthy quiet that the wind could not penetrate. The air was cool, but not cold, holding a steady, neutral temperature. It smelled of damp earth, of clay, and of the faint, clean scent of poplar wood. She lit a small fire in the stove, using only a few pieces of scavenged kindling. Within minutes, a wave of radiant warmth spread through the space. The clay walls and earthen floor, which had been cool to the touch, began to absorb the heat. This was the principle of thermal mass her grandfather had described. The earth itself became a gentle radiator, holding the warmth and releasing it slowly and evenly long after the fire had died down. That night, she slept more soundly than she had in months, cocooned in the quiet, steady warmth of the earth. In the town of Prosperity, the cold was beginning to bite in earnest. The monthly wood rations were proving to be woefully inadequate. Families huddled together in a single room of their homes, closing off the rest to conserve heat. A persistent, hacking cough began to make its way through the community. The faces of the townsfolk grew pinched and pale. They burned wood with a desperate anxiety, watching their precious stacks dwindle with each passing day. When they spoke of Alara Vance, It was with a mixture of scorn and a strange, unacknowledged resentment. Her defiance was an irritant, her self-sufficiency a reproach to their own shivering conformity. They saw her small wisp of smoke rising from the prairie and called it a fool's signal fire. December arrived, and with it, the first heavy snow. It blanketed the landscape in a pristine, unforgiving white. The temperature plummeted and held, refusing to climb above freezing even at midday. Ilara's life settled into a quiet routine. She needed to run her stove for only 2 or 3 hours a day, once in the morning to cook and heat the space for the day, and once in the evening. Her small pile of scavenged wood, which would not have lasted 2 days in her old house, now looked as if it could last for months. The interior of her lodge maintained a consistent temperature of around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, a comfortable, life-sustaining warmth that felt like a miracle. Sunlight, entering through a small, south-facing window she had framed with oilcloth, provided light and a measure of passive solar heat during the day. She was not just surviving, she was comfortable. On December 18th, 1887, the sky took on a strange, bruised, yellowish-gray color. The air became unnaturally still, and the temperature began to drop with an alarming speed. Ilara, stepping outside to gather a bucket of snow to melt for water, felt it instantly. It was a cold that was different, a cold with teeth and a palpable weight. Her grandfather had spoken of these storms, the land hurricanes that could sweep down from the north with no warning, blizzards of such ferocity that they could freeze a man solid in his tracks. She checked the seal on her door, added a few extra logs to the stove, and settled in to wait. The storm hit Prosperity not like a weather front, but like a physical blow. The wind came first, a low moan that rose within minutes to a deafening, demonic shriek. It was a wind that did not gust, but maintained a constant, terrifying pressure. A solid wall of moving air that seemed intent on scouring the town from the face of the earth. Then the snow came, not as flakes, but as a horizontal torrent of fine, blinding ice crystals. Visibility dropped to 0. The world beyond any window pane ceased to exist, replaced by a churning, white chaos. The temperature fell with a speed that defied all experience. From 10 degrees above 0 to 10 below, then 20, then 30 below 0. The townsfolk, huddled in their drafty houses, felt the cold press in on them, a tangible, invading force. They fed their stoves with a frantic desperation, but the heat was simply stolen away by the wind clawing at the walls and the bitter cold seeping through the floors. The precious quarter cords of wood vanished not in days, but in hours. Inside the frame houses, the battle was lost before it had truly begun. Frost ferns on the inside of window panes thickened into solid sheets of ice. The nails in the walls contracted with the cold, groaning with loud pops and cracks that sounded like pistol shots. Water in buckets froze solid. Ink in inkwells turned to slush. The cold was an anesthetic, numbing fingers and toes, then a predator, chasing the warmth from their bodies, driving them ever closer to the dwindling fires. In the town hall, which had been designated the emergency shelter, the situation was rapidly becoming catastrophic. Mayor Thompson, Reverend Miller, and Jedediah Croft had gathered there with 24 other families, believing the larger building and its substantial stove offered the best chance of survival. For the first few hours, their confidence held. But the wind was a relentless thief. It tore at the roof shingles, creating new and bigger drafts. Around midnight, a section of the main chimney, weakened by the constant pressure, collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a shower of soot and ice into the room and rendering the large stove useless. The temperature inside the hall began to plummet to match the deadly cold outside. Panic, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to set in. Not one of them had lost a family member to the fever that spring. Not one of them had burned through their wood supply in the first weeks of winter. And not one of them, huddled in the growing, fatal cold of their failed sanctuary, would admit they had been wrong. But their conventional wisdom had turned to ash. Their prudent plans were a mockery. Their sturdy, upright houses were becoming tombs. Meanwhile, in her mound of earth, Alara Vance was warm. The storm was an abstraction, a symphony of rage conducted far above her head. The wind howled, but it was a distant sound, unable to find purchase on the low, aerodynamic curve of her roof. The immense weight of the snow that was beginning to accumulate on top of the sod only served to increase the insulation, packing her in, sealing her away from the fury outside. The temperature inside the lodge held steady. The air was calm. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire in her small stove and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She sat on her bed, reading a book by the light of a kerosene lamp, a small island of profound peace in an ocean of meteorological violence. It was Jedediah Croft, the pragmatist, whose mind broke first from the paralysis of fear gripping the men in the town hall. His daughter was shivering uncontrollably in his arms, her lips tinged with blue. He looked at the useless stove, at the terrified faces lit by the flickering emergency lanterns, at the ice forming on the inside of the walls. He thought of the endless, back-breaking labor, the scorn, the whispers, and he thought of the single, thin wisp of smoke he had seen rising from the prairie day after day. The girl in the hole, the crazy widow, the prairie dog. Her shelter, he stammered, his words barely audible over the shriek of the wind. Mayor Thompson turned to him, his face a mask of disbelief. The Vance girl, her hole in the ground. The words hung in the frigid air. It was an admission of utter, catastrophic failure. It was also their only hope. An idea that had been laughable 2 months ago now presented itself as the sole possibility of salvation. The decision was made in desperation. Tying a rope between them so they would not be separated in the whiteout, Croft, Thompson, and the Reverend, along with a handful of other men, ventured out into the storm. The force of the wind knocked them to their knees. The cold was a physical agony, burning their lungs with every breath. They could not see more than a foot in front of their faces. They navigated by pure instinct and a desperate memory of the landscape, aiming for the gentle slope on the edge of town. The journey of a few hundred yards became an Arctic expedition, a life-or-death struggle against an elemental power that wanted them dead. They fell, they crawled, their beards and eyebrows freezing solid, their hope dwindling with every agonizing step. They found it only because one of them stumbled over the low profile of the stovepipe sticking out of a snowdrift. They clawed at the snow, shouting until their throats were raw, finally locating the heavy plank door of the entrance tunnel. They hammered on it with frozen fists, their frantic pounding a weak, pathetic sound against the storm's roar. The door opened. A wave of warm, breathable air washed over them, a sensation so alien and welcome it felt like a dream. Alara stood there, holding a lantern. She was not wearing a heavy coat, only her simple dress. Her face, illuminated by the warm, gentle light, showed no surprise, no triumph, no scorn. There was only a quiet, solemn understanding. She simply stood aside and let them in. They stumbled down the short tunnel and into the lodge itself. The transition was so abrupt, so total, that it defied belief. One moment they were in a maelstrom of lethal wind and ice. The next, they were in a space of impossible warmth and stillness. The air was filled with the gentle, radiant heat from the small stove. The silence was absolute. They stared, speechless, at the smooth clay walls, the sturdy wood frame, the simple, orderly living space. They looked at their own frost-covered clothes, at their numb, white fingers, and then back at the impossible sanctuary around them. Jedediah Croft was the first to find his voice. "We were wrong," he whispered, the words catching in his throat, thick with shame and relief. Mayor Thompson, his face streaked with frozen tears, could only nod, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a shivering, humbled man. Reverend Miller looked around the circular room, at the earthy walls that had saved him, and for the first time in his life, he had no sermon to deliver. He sank to the floor, his head in his hands, undone by a wisdom he had so piously condemned. Ilara said nothing. She simply gestured for them to move deeper into the space to make room for others. She handed them a blanket and put a pot of water on the stove to melt snow for them to drink. Her actions were simple, practical, and devoid of judgment. Her silence was more powerful than any accusation. It was the silence of the earth itself, which did not care for their opinions, their pride, or their folly. It simply offered shelter to those wise enough to seek it. Over the next hour, guided by the men who had returned with ropes, the rest of the survivors from the town hall made the perilous journey. More than 30 people, men, women, and children, crowded into the 20-foot circle. They packed in, shoulder to shoulder, a shivering, chastened flock. The little earth lodge, the object of their ridicule, had become an ark. It held them all, its warmth and stability a testament to a truth they had refused to see. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. For 2 days and 3 nights, the leaders and citizens of Prosperity lived as refugees, dependent on the foresight and labor of the young woman they had ostracized. They witnessed the profound efficiency of her design, how little wood it took to keep them all from freezing, how the structure seemed to shrug off the storm's worst fury. They saw that her home was not a grave, but the most vital and intelligent building in the entire town. When the storm finally broke on the morning of December 21st, the world was transformed. The sun rose on a landscape buried under 10-foot drifts of snow, a world of sculpted, silent white. The town of Prosperity was a ruin. Roofs had collapsed, walls had been breached, and inside many of the houses, families who had not made it to the town hall or to Ilara's lodge were found frozen, silent casualties of a conventional wisdom that had failed them. The final count was 17 dead, 17 lives lost to pride and a refusal to listen. The survivors emerged from the Earth Lodge into the blinding sun, blinking like newborns. They looked at the devastation around them, and then back at the simple, grass-covered mound that had saved them. It was no longer a hole in the ground. It was a testament. In the days that followed, the story of Ilara Vance and her winter house became a local legend, a somber lesson spoken in hushed, reverent tones. The men who had mocked her now sought her counsel. They came to her not with condescension, but with the humble deference of students to a master. They asked her to teach them, to show them how to build their own lodges, how to listen to the old wisdom they had so foolishly discarded. Ilara Vance was no longer the town outcast. She was its sage, its savior. Her vindication was absolute. But she took no joy in it. It had been purchased at too high a cost, written in the ledger of 17 frozen souls. Her triumph was not in being right, but in being alive, and in the quiet, profound knowledge that the earth, if respected, will always provide a sanctuary. She had not conquered the winter. She had simply accepted its embrace, and in doing so, had shown a town built on arrogance the true meaning of prosperity.